Hello, hello, delicious humans. Wonderful to come to your ears or your eyes and connect with you again. All of those people out there aspiring to be amazing leaders, lead a great life, and serve others, the planet, and each other in the process. As you know, every month I love to bring to you a guest, someone who's super cool and doing really good stuff in the world. And I've been waiting for a little while to speak to this beautiful gentleman you see before you because I was waiting till I had read some of his book, Radical Thinking. None other than Brad Twynham. G'day, Brad. How are you, mate?
Hey, I'm good, AJ. How are you? It's awesome to be here.
It is awesome to have you on as a guest. And I think it was a year or two ago that we first met, and we met at a mutual friend, Christina Giacometti's book
Right.
launch, of her own book launch. And you did a bit of an acknowledgement of country there and also shared a bit of your story. And I was so inspired by it. I think I've been following you and, watching from afar all the great things you're doing in the world ever since. So an honor to have you join us today.
Thanks so much.
So I always like to start because lots of people who listen here are looking to how they become better leaders, how they build more robust organizations, how they develop organizations, cultures and teams that are going to last the test of time, that can handle the ups and downs of the world. And we've certainly been through many in the past couple of years. And when I was first reading about radical leadership and radical thinking, I was like, this is perfect for where we're at right now. But I'm guessing you didn't just start that way. You weren't born going, I've got this idea and I'm going to take it to the world. So I always like to start way back at the beginning and get people to share a little bit about how did you get to be where you are now, where you are this kind of leadership consultant or someone that's going into organizations helping them with their strategy and their thinking and keynote speaking and those sorts of things. That's where you're at now, but how did you get here? And I know it's quite a tangled web, so you tell your version of that.
Well, I wouldn't say a tangled web, but it wasn't a straight line trajectory. Let's just say that. So look, I was born on the Darubbin River, the Hawkesbury River, in New South Wales, one of our most ancient river systems. My mother was an Aboriginal woman, known that since I was a young boy, and so always grew up with that knowledge and always had an appreciation and a connection to the land and the country. So just get that out of the way. That's sort of my very formative years. Unfortunately, as a result of that, I was bullied pretty heavily in school. Even though I'm pretty well bleached, it didn't matter to the kids at the school. I used to get one couple of incidents. I was tied up to a tree. They got some sticks, pretended they were spears, started throwing them at me, that kind of stuff, when I was 5, 6 years old. And that continued pretty much all the way through primary school, into my early years in high school. And I think that's an important part of the story that I don't quite often tell, because it gave me, at a very early age, the tenacity to be able to go, it's not me that they're angry about, it's something else. They're just doing it to me. And that's something I had to work through throughout my entire life. And I think there's one of two ways you can go when events like that happen to you. You can either become the victim, or you can go, screw them, I'm going to show them. Yeah. And for whatever reason, and I still don't know why, it's probably a temperamental thing more than anything else, I was more on the screw them, I'm going to show them, that I can rise above this and I'm better than they are. And so I buckled down and started working rather than becoming a victim about all of it. Doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It hurt like hell. But my first career then, I was quite a chubby little kid. I was probably a solid build. That was part of the problem of why I was getting teased. So my first career was actually as an aerobics instructor, believe it or not. And
oh my gosh.
So yeah,
back in the
late 80s, early 90s, I was, sort of one of the leading aerobics instructors in and around Sydney. I was teaching in gyms right across Sydney. I was doing between 30 and 40 aerobics classes a week, which was just an insane amount of physical activity each week. That's how I earned my way through university. And that was quite entrepreneurial in itself, because I essentially built that sort of business from scratch. And and built up what I was doing. And I enjoyed being up in front of the class and performing and getting fitness out of that. And then in my early 20s, I guess I had a career change when I finished university. I sort of went through a bit of a depression, probably because I just burnt myself out doing so many aerobics classes while doing a university degree. And then took my entrepreneurial talents and moved into the corporate IT space. And I knew nothing about IT at the time. I thought at that point, people, computers were sold by zitty-faced teenagers at Harvey Norman. I didn't know there was this world of corporate computing that was going on with these multi-million-dollar mainframes and all that type of stuff. And it really piqued my interest for some reason. I don't know why. I just found it challenging. And so I met a guy. He said, "I want to start a business. Do you want to be part of it?" I said, "Yeah, why not? Let's do it. Let's just get into it." And so for about a year, I was on the phone to senior project leaders, CEOs, and my job was to ask them about their IT projects coming up. And at first, they were talking about WANs, LANs, distributed networks. I had no idea what they were talking about. So I had my trusty IT dictionary next to me, and I'd write down all these words. And at the end of the phone call, I'd look them up in the dictionary, and then I'd go, "Oh, now I understand what that is." And within about 3 months, I actually started to know more about their projects than most of them did, because I was speaking to so many different people.
Yeah.
And so I started actually bringing value to those conversations rather than just taking down notes.
Right.
And those conversations just started getting richer and richer and richer. And then the next thing, they're asking me for advice, who to speak to, all that type of stuff. And so I built this massive network. Now, that business was a monumental failure. We were basically trying to do LinkedIn well before it had happened.
Right.
And so I ended up going and working for one of my clients in that business, who, to cut a long story short, then got acquired by a company called BEA Systems, which was the number one company, the most highly funded startup out of Silicon Valley in the early 90s.
Wow. Big company.
And at the age of 23 years old, I became the vice president of Asia Pacific, and basically went and built the Asia Pacific network for that company. That was about an 8-year journey. Ended up exiting that. I had these things called stock options, had no idea what they were. 5 years later, I get told I'm a multi-millionaire. I've got all this money, blew all this money, as you do as a young person. And then I thought, okay, well, there's a problem that I see here, which is that people are buying this technology, but they don't know how to implement it. So I went and built a methodology with some of the technical people I knew, started a consulting company, scaled that one. And that started, I guess, a journey of about a 10-year continuous innovation journey, which then led me to co-founding a technology startup called Service Mesh, which then took me to the US. So that was sort of my second career, which lasted 25 years. And then a twist of fate with that, which I guess is the subject of this book, Radical Thinking. About 18 months after we sold that company, it was a great exit. We built the business from scratch to a $280 million exit within 5 years. My former business partner and good friend, ended up getting investigated by the FBI. A bunch of people served time in jail. I got caught up in the middle of that, and then had to navigate my way through that particular interesting episode, if you like. And I think I then had to rebirth my career again. So that's probably a good point to start this particular interview, if we're going to talk about the book. But that's sort of what brought me to where I am now.
Amazing. Gosh. And I think not many people, I mean, we all say we didn't start out and our careers doesn't just go like that from A to B. But I do think there's lots of angles in yours that might be quite unique to you. Having that perspective of a connection to country right in the beginning, and I see your totems on the wall behind you.
Yeah.
And I've seen some of your presentations, so I know that deep connection still runs through what you're doing. And I also think it's fascinating how our strengths show up in different ways in our careers, because I also was an aerobic instructor, perhaps not as prolific as you. I was also a PT and did lots of PT stuff, but I used to teach aerobics at BHP gym. So that's a lot of guys coming off shift that just wanted to sweat hard and lift heavy. So probably a bit different to running 30 or 40 classes a week. But I think that helps you to read a room, doesn't it? To start to understand people, to also be comfortable enough to speak from the front of the room and be the odd one out and be okay with that. Yeah. So in some ways, I see your leadership then was early on. And I love then that your conversations around business development and the curiosity about understanding what are the problems some of those businesses are facing is what eventually gave you kind of the platform for the next part of your career. And so in a way, you were serving and being in that steward role right from an early age, which a lot of people don't discover till much later in their career.
Yeah, and in a way, I feel like I went full circle. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I always enjoyed leading groups, being up in front of groups, talking with groups, and always had that ideal. I'd like to return to that, but I guess I got lost then in the corporate, what do you call it? The hamster wheel. Yeah, the machinery. And I really enjoyed that. I got to admit, I did enjoy it. There was something very alluring about that lifestyle.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there was a big part of me that was missing, which was that contribution at a deeply personal level to other people, which I used to get from doing aerobics. You know, you're making a profound difference to people's lives, even though you're up there dancing in front of them and leading them how to do that. But now I'm doing that in a different way. So in a way, it's sort of come full circle. And one of the things I've realized is quite often we have to take those journeys to become real effective leaders. We almost need to, we start off, I believe, at our center, and then we drift away from that because we need to go and explore other aspects of ourselves, which then when we come back full circle, get amplified and become, you know, really ground us in that authenticity of what it takes to be a great leader.
I love what you just said. And I think it really made me instantly, reminded me of Joe Dispenza and some of his teaching, which is around this 0 point. And that's where our flow state is. And he actually monitors people's brain when they meditate and do other things that bring them into that 0 point and can show when they're going to get creative spark and ideas.
Yeah.
And I couldn't agree more. I think for many of us early in our career, we tend to drift away from that 0 point into the material because we're growing a family, we're trying to pay bills. Right. You know, you were living a great lifestyle in LA, I believe, you know, and all of those sorts of things. And we have the flash car or whatever it might be. We're in a bit of a cumulative. And then we realize, we burn out, we come back to center and we go, okay. And then for some of us, I know for me, I started to explore the spiritual for quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that can go too woo-woo and we can float off into the clouds. Yeah. And so the 0 point somehow is this coming back to being whole and healed and centered and grounded, which is a little bit of both, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've never heard of that 0 point, but I love the metaphor of it. I think it's a beautiful metaphor. And for me as well, when I went through that FBI investigation, that drew me back, first of all, to my tribal country, which is here on the Central Coast. It's where my family grew up. It's where my family been walking country here for 45,000 years or more. And I remember in the absolute terror of those evenings where I'm thinking, you know, I could go to jail at any moment. I used to dream about going out bush with kangaroos and the kangaroos protecting me. And that's my skin group is the Patagarang, which you can see behind me. And so, you know, it was that grounding back to that 0 point at that time of crisis that then ultimately shaped a lot of the messages that I'm now delivering today as part of my radical leadership programs and radical thinking keynote.
Yeah, amazing. So let's talk a bit about the radical thinking and some of what you're developing around there. It sounds like you kind of needed to reinvent yourself in a way and that you've drawn on all of those lessons. For anyone who's never heard the term radical leadership before, what does it mean for you in your words?
Yeah. So I believe in today's constantly changing world, and one of the things I talk about a lot is change isn't the problem. The problem is that the external world's now changing faster than our internal mental models can keep pace with. And the biggest challenge is when the world out there doesn't look like we think it should look in here, we
Mhm.
get defensive, we get apathetic, and we get dismissive of what that world could look like. And then we live in fear and we make poor decisions. So that's the fundamental hypothesis. And so going through that experience where I was never charged with a crime, but I was categorized as a person of interest not charged, which is a
Mm.
tremendously ambiguous space to be in, because it basically means if they want to, they could charge you in order to put pressure on you, or they could leave you alone and hope that you'll come along and cooperate. They were holding my assets in the United States through a piece of legislation that was written in 1804. And I was fighting a civil case over there to get my assets back. Essentially, that went as far as it could. And then suddenly the FBI have an in-camera session with the judge. The whole thing's put on hold indefinitely pending the criminal investigation, which could go for years. So gone from having millions of dollars to having nothing, gone from having security in who I was and security in just walking around outside without having to think about at any moment that could change, to
Mm.
being in this tremendously ambiguous state and volatile state for, 2.5, 3 years. And during that time, I started reading a lot of white papers about AI, the metaverse, robotics, a whole bunch of stuff. And I thought, there's this tsunami of change coming. And
Yeah.
what I'm feeling, every leader's going to feel sometime in the next decade. And one of the things I had to learn more than anything else is I had to learn how to deliberately and consciously shape my environment, because in that state of being faced with that ambiguity, if I'd have allowed my natural way of being, which we all have, which is that defensive state, that state of thinking about the world and just being protective, to be completely honest, it would have taken me out. There were many dark days where I was probably that close to being pushed over the edge. And so I was in that position where I really had to deliberately and consciously shape my environment. So what did that mean? Well, I had to remove myself out of the way. So first of all, I had to find techniques that would stop me thinking in certain automatic ways, and then stop that from happening so I could think in another way.
Mm.
Um,
Hack
almost
your own
had to,
brain, essentially.
yeah, absolutely. I had to almost break the habit of being myself. I think
Yeah.
that's probably a good way of doing it. And then I had to consciously replace those thoughts. I had to fill that vacuum that then came from that conscious shift with what I was actively creating.
Mm.
And so there's two aspects to being a radical leader. One is, deliberately shaping your environment, and consciously shaping your environment are the two big aspects. And as I looked at that, I thought that's a really radical idea. Like in today's world where managers are thrown into these jobs with very little training, with very little knowledge, there's all this change coming. That is a radical idea, to go, rather than being at the effect of all of these forces occurring and coming on you, be at the cause of it, is a radical idea. And how do we do that? And so that then became the basis of my work, if you like, for radical thinking, was helping leaders navigate this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world that we're now in a way that is conscious and deliberate. And so that, and it just stuck. Like I started putting it out there and people got naturally interested. They're like, what is radical? And everyone wants to be radical. Let's face
Yeah.
it. We all want to be radical. And so the positioning just stuck, but the message is really simple, which is manage yourself before you can manage other people. So.
And so in that, like, I think for a lot of people, when they think radical, they instantly think, oh, maybe you've got a mohawk, or,
Right.
lots of piercings. Like, that's the radical. I love that this is something that everyone can apply in their leadership, in their role, and in their work. And I was actually just reading this part again last night, which is all about what you're saying, which is radical leaders have mastered this ability to shift from the unconscious to the conscious.
Yes.
And that we're actively working in that new brain, and that's when we can access higher cognitive functions.
Yes.
I'm interested in something that might be a bit left of center, and you may or may not have a thought on this right now, and that's
Sure.
okay. But I know from walking and sitting with elders myself and having the privilege to do that, I observe how conscious they are and how they observe changes in the environment, the wind changing in the trees, things that are quite subtle, and then their consciousness around how they contribute next or what they say or don't say. That is very different to what I see when I'm working with C-suite executives who are just firing constantly and saying the next thing that comes to their brain.
Yeah, I love where you're going with this. And that exact, what you just stated is the exact topic of my next book coming out called Radical Intelligence.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, you know, radical thinking to me is the base of how we need to think in this ever-changing world. Radical intelligence is how do we become adaptable learners? How do we get ourselves into the state where we can learn, unlearn, and relearn at the speed of technological change? Because we're never going to catch up to technology, so we can only constantly adapt.
Yes.
And I believe mastery of the ego is key to that. And if you look at, you just said you've been sitting with elders, if you look at the fundamental foundation of our indigenous culture, it was very spiritual. And that spiritual journey, put in very simple terms, was the development and overcoming of the ego. And when you can develop and overcome the ego, then you can sit in those spaces of silence and start mastering things around you through observation. And I think there's huge lessons and relevance in that today for modern leaders.
Yeah. And what I think is really exciting, and I talk a lot about steward eldership, which is the later part of our career, not necessarily because we've aged, but because we are starting to garner some of that wisdom, and maybe we have dealt with our dear ego to an extent that we can start elevating our thinking to a different position and take a bit more of a global perspective, and not just what's the best for my immediate team or this week or this month, but what's better overall for humanity. Coming back to in the moment, for a leader who's listening to this, how might they consciously shape their environment? How might they switch out of that automatic mode when we are feeling pressured to push, go, 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 because everything is so fast? Do you have a tips or some ideas, or is it a deep sitting that's going to take a lot longer? Do you have any ideas for people that go, I want to pattern interrupt some of that unconsciousness?
Yeah. Look, I mean, at a very simple level, and look, radical thinking is based around 5 core capabilities that we need to develop. That's a big conversation, even to start unpacking that today. But the five capabilities are radical open-mindedness, radical creativity, radical empathy, radical acceptance, and radical candor. So each one of those is a, you know, multi-day conversation just to get into. Each of them have their own set of techniques. But at a basic level, for a pattern interrupt, we need to notice when what I call dad mode has been triggered.
Oh,
so I'll give you a metaphor of what dad mode is, right? I love my dad. My dad is a first-generation English migrant. He migrated here when he was 14 years old. Got a good relationship with him, particularly given we haven't had a great relationship for our entire lives together, but we've sort of mended those bridges to a point, and we have a reasonably good relationship. Now, when the external world doesn't look like my dad thinks it should look, for example, when a 10-year-old son says that tomato sauce tastes better on hot chips than vinegar and salt, then, you know, one of 3 things happen, if not all 3 at the same time. He becomes defensive, he becomes apathetic, and he becomes dismissive. And I believe they are 3 predominant emotions that we experience when we are acting in that default way of unconsciousness. They are the 3 dominant emotions. Now, there is an optimistic version of those called morbid curiosity, right? So when we get morbidly curious about something, that's the optimistic version of those 3 things going on. And so when the first thing you've got to do is start noticing when you are acting in that way, and it will be more often than you realize, right? Because you're so switched off to it that it's become the default way of acting. And when you notice that you're acting that way, you've just got to say to yourself, stop. How do I choose to react in this situation? Now, that is much harder to do than to say, trust me.
Yes.
And so the first part of, I guess, waking up and that first step towards becoming radical is understanding when dad mode is activated, yeah, and learning how to stop that in its tracks, which is simply saying, stop, I'm not entertaining that. I'm actually consciously making the decision to actually focus on this. So I'll give you a classic example that happens a lot in leadership roles. There is someone in your team who drives you mad. Absolutely drives you mad. There's something about their personality. They've said something to you. They've accidentally done a misstep and you've gone, this person, written them off in your head. Yeah. Now, the unfortunate thing for that person is they're in a no-win situation the minute that happens, right? Because you've formed a bias and that bias is kicking off every time they speak to you. They could be giving you the greatest compliment in the world and you're going, what does this douchebag want from me, right?
Yeah.
So realizing that and noticing when that comes up and saying, stop, I want to listen to this person with an open mind, right? You might need to do that 5 times in a conversation of 30 seconds, right? But realizing that is the first step to becoming radical. And that is a hard step to make. And it's a hard step most of us don't take.
Yeah, because it's kind of that catching yourself in the moment, but it's also that 10-second pause to respond, not react.
Yes.
Which is what a lot of Indigenous cultures, it's what a lot of ancient practices like yogic things, Chinese, you know, all talk about that, learning to observe the self, become the observer so that you can notice it mindfully when I'm in that moment. And I can see how your radical open-mindedness, the radical creativity, the empathy, all of those feed in to help you do that. I think for me, it was having a mentor once that used to tell me she aimed for perfection 3% of the time, because I was so in overachiever mode that, you know, I had to do everything perfectly. And I remember it was always you either pass or fail, you win or you lose. You know, I was very in that black or white. And she encouraged me to think about you either pass or you learn. And so instead of thinking, oh, I failed that test, or, you know, I failed to land that customer, it was like, what have I learned? I'm learning. You know, you either pass, you win, or you learn. And that helped me start to pause and reflect, I guess, rather than just being like out.
Yeah. Very similar principle. Yeah, but you've got to, you know, I think the key thing is first, you've got to observe yourself.
Yeah.
We spend so much time trying to observe other people rather than observing ourselves. And then if we don't observe ourselves, you can be guaranteed that you're acting in some kind of default unconscious way. And when we step into that space, anything that we're doing at an unconscious level is going to be ego driven, because that's our default.
Yeah, because we're dear little humans. At the end of the day, we're all just dear little humans doing our thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, the reality is 2 million years of evolution, right, has taught us to defend ourselves against things that aren't good.
Yeah.
We don't have saber-toothed tigers running around out there wanting to kill us anymore. So what are we defending ourselves against? Well, essentially, ideas have become the new saber-toothed tiger.
Yeah.
Right? And there's a whole range of psychological research that's gone into that, is that ideas, social isolation, those types of things that they're as real as a saber-toothed tiger coming towards us for many, many people, for a majority of people.
Yeah.
And I might gel with an idea because it completely agrees with my worldview 1 minute, but then someone else presents another idea and it completely, you know, shreds me to pieces, right?
Switches on dad mode.
Switches on dad mode. And so that's the work we need to do today, because we are in this world of ideas. Some of those ideas are good, some of them are not so good, some of them have good aspects and bad aspects, and we need to navigate our way through those. What we're seeing at the moment, I believe, is a unconscious reaction to things we see, which is then polarizing and forcing a very clear division down 2 lines. And as leaders, we can't afford to do that. Our job as leaders today, more than it's ever been before, is holding multiple worldviews, listening to multiple worldviews, and then ultimately making the decision that we need to make as leaders based on what's positive, what's negative, and what's interesting about all those different views that we're receiving.
Yeah, and being able to discern and choose a path forward, but also to be able to choose again if it doesn't end up being one worth following. I guess I want to just drill into one of those of your elements before we wrap up. And I thought it was going to be radical empathy, because I think soft skills are so critical for leaders. Especially now as technology gets better and better, we have to be able to do the soft skills, because it is the thing I think that differentiates us from robots. And even though they're starting to have expression and all sorts of things, but that's that radical.
Well, they're starting to simulate. That's
expression. Right.
So
yes.
we need to be careful with that. Right.
That's right. And they're learning how to respond to things and those sorts of things,
Correct.
but they actually can't feel it. And that's probably the radical acceptance, because hearing your story and all the FBI investigation and even the challenges back to being bullied at school, at what point did the radical acceptance lesson start to sit with you? Because I think it's important to your story if you felt to include it as well.
Yeah. I went through a really tough time in my late 20s. I got married pretty early. It was the wrong woman, ultimately. Bad mistake from my part.
Wrong for you at the time. Yeah.
Wrong career. Yeah, absolutely. I was in the wrong space, got married for the wrong reasons, married the wrong person, a whole range of things. But I went into a really deep depression after that. And I went into blaming her and my background and my bullying and how it shaped my life. And I started getting into this real victim mentality. And I remember I stumbled across a book, I think it was by Carolyn Meese at the time. It was around the dark night of the soul and the dark journey of the soul. And I started reading that. And that book is all about owning those dark sides of yourself and owning those the shadow aspect of yourself. And I'd never considered that before. And I always pushed that away from me, that shadow aspect. And I think the beginning of that journey towards radical acceptance, for me at least, was owning and taking 100% responsibility, is that there was part of me that was fractured and disconnected, that was drawing those things to me. And it actually wasn't about those people. It was about me. And if you look at really what's at the basis of radical thinking and my radical leadership program, it's that 100% ownership, that it actually has nothing to do with anyone else. It's all me. It's all about me, but it's not about me, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
And I think radical acceptance ultimately is, first of all, getting to the root cause of why something happened, why that disappointment happened, why that situation happened, why you're revisiting that particular thing in your life at the moment again. Owning it in its entirety. There's nothing to do. Clearly it's coming back at me because there is something for me to learn here. And then accepting that, which is the hard part. The actual hard part of all that is accepting it and forgiving yourself, because that's just part of your life journey. It's part of the lessons that you're here to learn. And then being able to move through that with grace, dignity, and exploring, okay, well, do I continue down the same path, or do I change tact and go down a different path? And so I think that in a nutshell is radical acceptance. It's a psychological term. It's not, I didn't make it up. I just believe it's one of those capabilities that's core to building resilience. And one thing I learned is it's not something that some people innately have and others don't. It's a capability that can be taught and it can be developed. And I think that's the game changer, because we often think, oh, here's this guy, he's really resilient. It must be because he's strong, or there's something in his life, or there's some temperamental thing. And it's not. It's just, I learnt that capability when I was depressed in my early 30s. So when I got hit with this massive thing in my 40s, it was like, I've been here before. I've trodden this path, and I can accelerate all those learnings to help me through this particular thing.
Right, because you build a bit of the muscle,
Because the
right?
muscle's there. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. And I think in every leadership program I've ever done as well, it's always been 100% accountability and ownership first, you know, to get into that I'm responsible for everything and my response to everything in my world, you know, and creating that. And also that concept of leadership's shadow that often is forgotten, that the higher we go, the bigger the shadow we cast.
Yeah.
And so if we haven't dealt with some of that stuff, the higher CEOs or executives or community leaders go, the more that can have a big impact on others as well. And can be running along, making a lot of damage along the way. Yeah, unintentional.
And one of the things that allows you to do as a leader, particularly an up and coming leader, is it allows you to have an opinion about something and not be attached to that that's the right opinion. It's just my opinion at that particular point in time.
Yes.
And when you can get to that, I think that is, as someone who's been a CEO, looking at who can I rely on as my people, as my trusted people in my organization, it's those who can express an opinion without attachment to it being right are the ones I'm going to trust the most.
Yes.
And when you can only do that if you can actually own those shadow aspects of yourself, because then you develop that innate unshakability to express an opinion that might not be the right one.
Yes.
And when you can start doing that, in my personal opinion, and I'm not saying I'm right about this, but in my personal opinion, they are the people that leaders will ultimately turn to assist them in achieving their outcomes.
Absolutely. And they'll also express radical candor, as you say.
Yeah.
I know that reminds me of my grandfather, and thinking about elders who have had an influence on us. My grandfather used to say to me, you can have an opinion and you should stand up for your opinion. But he used to always say to me, but remember, you can be right or you can stay married.
Yes, exactly. 100%.
And so I have like just two final questions for you. One of them that just kind of piqued, and that is in a lot of the work I'm doing around steward eldership, I'm looking at ways that we can actually sing up our elders in business, in life, in culture, whatever they might be. But I think all too often in this modern world, we really do sing up youth and new and fast and technology. And yet there are nursing homes around. There are people who are starting to retire from the workforce, maybe before they've actually given their wisdom. And I think there's this real opportunity to sing up the value that wisdom brings. And so I'm curious, have you had an elder or someone in your life that has been a bit of a mentor or a spark, or is there someone you want to express your gratitude to?
Oh, wow. So many people I'd want to express my gratitude to. It's crazy. Look, of recent times, Uncle Bob Saunders is a Uluru elder. I met him when I was 23 years old. I went to one of his talks. It was called the Bondi Talks. They're on YouTube. It's an amazing talk. And he had this notion, he had a word that he used to use called kanyini. And that word was lost on me for many, many years. And recently, as I was going back through and developing my my intellectual property in and around this radical intelligence idea that I'm developing at the moment, I came across a couple of videos that he made talking about kanyini, and kanyini means unconditional love and respect for everything and everyone. That's an Uluru word from the traditional owners, our Uluru way. And there's so much to unpack in that in terms of the unifying spirit of wisdom. And I think you get to a point where it's not your wisdom. You're just open enough for the wisdom to come through you and use you as a vessel to speak that outwardly. And that comes from life experience. It comes from overcoming challenges and obstacles. It comes from your own internal work to have that happen. So I think if there's anyone to acknowledge as to who I've evolved to later in life now, it would be, you know, Uncle Bob. Absolutely. And then that that work around Uni, he did an unconditional love and respect for everybody. And the other concept that he talks about as well, and you would know this from hanging out with a lot of elders, is this notion of ownership. I think is so limiting. Yeah. And in Indigenous culture, we often say that we don't own the land owns us. The land's been here for millions of years. We've been here for this long.
Yeah.
And so everything I do in life is actually not for me. It's for that next generation. It's for that next group of people coming through. And once again, that's teaching that Uncle Bob was so grounded in. And so, yeah, I think right now, given the journey I'm on and where I am in terms of that journey and building out concepts that business leaders can grasp onto, my vision is, wouldn't it be great if we could have every leader in every corporation in the world, rather than focusing on what's mine, my piece of the business, my P&L, my team, focusing on the ours. Yeah, what's ours?
Yeah.
Right? How do I ultimately make what I am doing a legacy for those leaders 4 generations to come?
Yeah.
Right? I think when you can start doing that, you turn leadership on its head, and it takes a whole different meaning.
And you turn business and the world
Yes.
on its head too, because we are smart enough to have creative solutions to all the world's problems.
Yes.
We've all got enough intelligence if we just pooled it collectively and looked at those problems collectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And the great thing about technology is I believe technology is consciously making that shift occur, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
It's a whole other conversation. But,
Yeah.
you know, if we look at AI, we look at the metaverse, we look at robotics, we look at the exponential technologies that are coming through that are starting to reshape the way we work, they are unconsciously forcing a conscious shift towards what we just spoke about. And the leaders who can embrace that now and get ahead of that are the ones that are going to ultimately have longevity.
Couldn't agree more. And I want to pay my respect to Uncle Bob that you mentioned, and to his teachings and all the teachings from all the elders that we've all had the privilege of living and working and walking with. My last question then is a little bit on the AI and the technology, because I know that's been huge in your career and life. And that is, what are you most excited about?
Oh, technology-wise?
Anything. What are you excited about for the future?
Oh, yeah. So I've been working on a new keynote at the moment, which I'm delivering for the first time next week.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to doing that. I've been working with a couple of mentors on just refining that. And one of the parts of that keynote is I look at artificial general intelligence, and as a short definition for that, that is essentially these humanoid robots we see who can react to real world situations, have tremendous amounts of dexterity, and almost have that extra simulated intelligence. So they, for all intensive purposes, feel like human beings, even though they're not. They're just simulating what a human being can do. And so everyone's seen the dancing dogs and the Atlas robot by Boston Dynamics that can do backflips and all that kind of stuff. But under the covers, Tesla have been working on a robot now for about 5 years. And that robot, the dexterity of that robot is absolutely incredible.
Right.
It can pick up an egg, it can crack an egg, it can start doing things that human beings can do. And if you look at its hands, it actually looks human-like the way it moves. It's absolutely incredible. It's called the Maximus. If you want to go online and Google Tesla Maximus robot, you'll see what I mean. That robot, Tesla believe they will put on the market for around $20,000 a unit. Now, to put that in perspective, it's about $750 a week. So for $750 a week, very soon, you'll be able to have a humanoid robot in your home that can cook, that can clean, that can make the kids' beds, that could probably mow the lawns, that could probably help you do fencing, that could probably feed the animals, could do a whole range of tasks that we don't like doing, right? However, here's the rub with that. That's hugely exciting to me, but here's the rub. The rub is what am I going to fill my time with if I no longer have to do that? And so the thing that excites me the most about technology, and particularly AI, is it's going to spiral all of our skills upwards. But if we're not conscious enough to be able to start redesigning and thinking about what am I going to fill that hole with all of that friction of stuff that I have to do that I don't like doing, what am I going to fill it with if that's no longer there? Then we're going to end up going off on these weird tangents that can lead us down very destructive rabbit holes. And so there has to be a real shift in consciousness. And to me, that's an exciting thing. And I think this big culture war we're seeing going on at the moment between the right and the left, particularly in the US, is a result of a conscious shift that's occurring at a societal level that will ultimately shake out somewhere around the middle. That's what I personally believe. But I believe it's AI that's forcing that shift to occur.
Amazing. Oh, all the things. I'm like, oh, I could do another whole podcast just on that. I think I've studied Dr. David Hawkins' work on the scale of consciousness and our emotions and history and consciousness. And he studied, you know, Nazis. He studied orchestral pieces of music and all sorts of things, and looked at the consciousness. And his prediction was that by 2055, I think, that humanity would reach its highest level of consciousness ever, which would be at 500 of love. And at present, we're just getting to 200, which is courage, which is the first time we're getting expansive. We actually dipped quite a bit to fear during COVID. And so his prediction was that we would be freed up, that we would be able to do more creative, you know, artistic, all sorts of things, because a lot of that menial work would be taken care of. And so I think his dream would have been extremely radical back then. I think its time has come, and I'm excited to see where you take that and how you lead people thinking that way in future.
Yeah. And believe it or not, there's organizations that are already starting to think like that. And that's the exciting thing. I'm working with a big law firm at the moment who is completely examining and re-looking at what does a graduate level law employee look like, you know, in 5 years' time. And it is nothing like they look today. So actually having a law degree is going to be probably the least of the considerations of someone stepping in at a graduate level law role in a firm in 5 years' time.
Because there's so much that machines will be able to do.
Correct. And I, you know, this whole narrative of we're heading down this AI zombie apocalypse that's going to take all our jobs and we're going to be living on these universal basic incomes. I don't buy that. I don't feel it. I'm not saying it won't happen, but I don't feel it. I believe what will happen is for 250 years or more, we've been industrialized. Human beings have had to step in and do things that machines should really be doing, but haven't been able to do. And I think what AI is going to do very, very quickly, much faster than we think, is actually remove the friction out of a lot of those tasks. What that will do is ultimately amplify our humanity, but we need to get back in touch with what that is. Because if we don't, we're going to go down a very dystopic path. And so I think there's a lot of work to do. I think it's urgent. I don't believe it's something that we can really not focus on now. But that's where I believe technology is ultimately taking us. And I'm quite excited about that, because I think a higher level of resonance, a higher level of consciousness is great. And I believe you have to hit the obstacles before you can break through to that next level of consciousness. And so when I look at the tremendous culture war that's going on at the moment between the far right and the far left, I see that as that challenge we need to break through in order to achieve that next layer of consciousness. And when we do that, I don't know, but I see it as a positive thing, not a negative thing.
I agree. And I think it's coming back exactly to what we started with, of that 0 point, and not going too far to the right or the left, but finding our grounding in the middle. And coming back to your book, it reminds us that we need radical open-mindedness, radical creativity, radical empathy, radical acceptance, radical candor about where we're at right now and how we're going to take that forward. And I think we create our own world, and I'm pretty excited to be in that world that you're dreaming of. I see it and feel it and touch it too. And I'm looking forward to being part of the co-creation along with you and many others. So thank you so much for sharing. This has been so much fun. It makes me go, oh, I want to talk longer, but I'm conscious of our time. So thank you so much for your generosity, your spirit today.
Thank you, AJ. It's been awesome having a chat to you, and wish all of your members of your community well as they try to grasp these concepts for themselves. And I hope we can speak again.
And until people maybe see you on a stage or at a conference near you, how can they best find you, and how can they go and purchase a copy of Radical Thinking as well?
Yeah, so it is limited release only at the moment. So the best thing you can do is get in touch with me via LinkedIn, as you did. So it's just Brad Twynham -speaker. You'll find me on LinkedIn. Just send me a private message and we can get you a copy. And if you want to follow me, you can either follow me on LinkedIn. You can go to my website, www.bradtwynham.com. And you can check out all my stuff there. There's a bunch of videos, there's workshops, everything I do is on that website. So I've deliberately kept my social platform purely to LinkedIn because my audience is professional. So yeah, you'll find me there or on my website.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Brad. Go and check him out. He's a beautiful human. And also, if you're organizing conferences and things like that, make sure that you put the people in touch with Brad. Thanks once again, Nanga. Many blessings.
Yano, thank you.